In the days of my early youth, the world was shaken with the dread of a new and terrible plague, which was desolating all lands as it passed through them, and so regular was its march that men could tell where next it would appear, and almost the day when it might be expected. It was the cholera, which for the first time appeared in Western Europe. Its bitter, strange kiss, and man's want of experience or knowledge of its nature, or how best to resist its attacks, added, if anything could, to its horrors. In those days, I lived with my parents and brothers in a provincial town in the west of Ireland called Sligo. It was long before the time of railroads and, I think, of steamboats, as news travelled slowly. Rumours of the Great Plague broke on us from time to time, as men talk of far-off things which can never come near themselves. But gradually the terror grew on us, as we heard of it coming nearer and nearer. It is in France, they said. It is in Germany. And it is in England. Then, with wild affright, we began to hear the whisper past. It is in Ireland. Men's senses began failing them for fear, and deeds were done in selfish dread, enough to call down God's direct vengeance on us. One action I vividly remember. A poor traveller was taken ill on the roadside, some miles from the town. And how did those Samaritans tend him? They dug a pit, and with long poles pushed him living into it, and covered him up quick, alive. Severely, like Sodom, did our city pay for such crimes. Trenches were now cut across the roads in the direction in which the cholera was said to come, concisely for the purpose of stopping all intercourse with the infected districts. No use. No use. One evening, we heard that a Mrs. Feeney, a very fat woman who was a music teacher, had died suddenly, and by the doctor's orders had been buried an hour after. With blanched faces, men looked at each other and whispered, "Cholera." But the whispers next day deepened to a roar, and in many houses lay one, nay 2 or 3 dead. One house would be attacked, and the next spared. There was no telling who would go next. And when one said goodbye to a friend, he said it as if forever. In a very few days, the town became a place of the dead. No vehicles moved except the cholera carts or doctors' carriages. Many people fled, and many of those were overtaken by the plague and died by the way. Some of the doctors made a good thing of it, as they said themselves at first, but one by one they too became victims, and others came and filled the gap, and then others again filled their places. Most of the clergy of all denominations fled, and few indeed were the instances in which the funeral service was read over the dead. The great county infirmary and fever hospital was turned into a cholera hospital, but was quite insufficient to meet the requirements of the situation. The nurses died one after another, and none could be found to fill their places, but women of the worst description, who were always more than half drunk, and such scenes were perpetrated there as would make the flesh creep to hear of. One Roman Catholic priest told us himself that he was obliged to sit day after day and night after night on the top of the great stone stairs with a horsewhip to prevent those wretches dragging the patients down the stairs by the legs with their heads dashing on the stone steps before they were dead. The habit was, when a new batch arrived for whom there were no beds, they would take those who were stupefied from opium and nearest death and remove them to make room for the new arrivals. Many were said to be buried alive. Our own household gradually ceased to go out or hear what went on outside. The last evening we were out, we went to see the family of Mr. Holmes. They were a large family: father, mother, grandmother, 3 or 4 sons, 3 daughters, and a little grandchild. We left them all well at 9 p.m. and next morning at 9 o'clock we heard that Mr. Holmes, his mother, 2 sons, a daughter, and the little child were all dead and buried. After that, we stayed pretty much in the house. Gradually the street in which we lived thinned out, as by 2 and 3s our dead neighbours were carried away. Our neighbours on both sides died. On one side, a little girl called Mary Sheridan was left alone and sick, and we could hear her cries. I begged my mother's leave to help her, and she let me go, with many fears. Poor Mary died in my arms an hour after. I returned home, and being well fumigated, was not affected. Day by day went without any change. Every morning at daybreak, a cry used to go from room to room over the house. Is anyone dead? But we were spared. In our whole lone street, only Dr. Little's family and our own remained without loss. Early on the morning of the 14th day, my mother said it was time for us to go and pack up, and at 10 o'clock we started on the mail coach for Ballyshannon, where lived some of my father's friends who we were sure would receive us. It was a damp, drizzling morning, and we felt very miserable, as if we had a forewarning of what lay before us. All went well until we got within a mile of a village about 4 miles from Ballyshannon, when the coach was met and stopped by a mob of men armed with sticks and pitchforks. We were ordered out, our luggage taken off, and no entreaties could prevail on those men to allow us to pass. Fear had maddened them. After a long parley and many threats of the vengeance of the law, the coach was allowed to proceed, and we were left on the roadside sitting on our trunks, cold, wet, hungry, and well nigh hopeless. After about an hour and a half, we saw my uncle's carriage coming towards us. He had heard of our situation, and he had come out to try and bring us in. We got into the carriages, but when we neared Ballyshannon, found we would not be allowed to remain. All we could get leave to do was drive through the town. My uncle had an old friend in Donegal, and he advised our going there, and wrote to beg her to receive us for a little. So on we went. We entered Donegal, but our arrival had been announced in some way, and the square where we entered was full of men howling like devils. Our luggage were taken, or rather torn from the carriages, and piled in the centre of the square. We were placed on it, and a cry went out, "Fire to burn the cholera people!" We thought our lost hour had surely come, and sat as quiet as we could, and tried to be resigned to our fate. Fortunately, the officer in command of the regiment was a man of humanity. The barracks gate opened into the square, and in an incredibly short time, he ordered out the troops who surrounded us in a square and faced the mob on all sides with fixed bayonets. We were now comparatively safe, but in what condition? Wet, cold, hungry, houseless, and surrounded by a howling multitude who would not even allow us to go on. It was decided that we should not be allowed to pass, but be sent back by the way we came, escorted by the military to protect us from the fury of the mob. So our carriages were again packed, and back we went with our escort, who left us about 7 miles on the road. The drivers advised that we should wait till dark, and they would drive us by a back way to our cousin's house in Ballyshannon. About 10 at night we arrived without detection and were warmly received by our cousins. We were fed and our feet bathed and beginning to feel quite comfortable when there was a great uproar in the street and the voices called for us to be brought out. But we now had the best of it and our cousins refused to open the doors. The noises continued and presently the chief magistrate of the town and 2 doctors arrived and civilly requested admittance. They were let in on promising to abstain from violence and we had to submit to a medical examination. We were declared free from cholera so far, but the house was put into quarantine and no one let out for some days. At the end of that time, we were able to live in peace till the plague had abated and we could return to Sligo. There we found the streets grass grown and 5/8 of the population dead. We had great reason to thank God who had spared us.